Welcome to the Coalition for Self-Direction Town Hall with the New York office of the Medicaid Inspector General. We're hoping that this is going to be the first of several meetings where we can handle some of the concerns that our community has, dispel some of the myths about what the New York OMIG does and does not do. The Medicaid Inspector General has created a PowerPoint that we believe will answer 15 of the most pressing questions. You have on the call, along with the Medicaid Inspector General, who I will introduce in just a moment. You have myself, representing the view of the parents, and I'll interrupt as needed for clarification. We have a couple of pauses during the meeting where I'll be joining in. My colleague and fellow parent, Jackie, will be also coming in with the viewpoint of the parent. And we're also joined by Linda Schellenberg, who will be representing the voice of the fiscal intermediary. So between the three of us, we believe that we will be able to do a good job of really representing the various voices and getting to clarity. From the Medicaid Inspector General today, we have Frank Walsh, the acting Medicaid Inspector General. You have the bios, so I'm not actually going to go through that. We sent those out in advance, but we're just thrilled to have Michael and his team here, including Michael Diallard, who is the Deputy Medicaid Inspector General for Audit, and Aaron Ives, who is the the first Deputy Medicaid Inspector General, and the fourth member of the team that we have here today is Bill Schwartz, whose camera isn't on right this moment. Oh, there he is. His camera is on. My apologies. Who is the Director of Public Affairs and Intergovernmental Relations.
My apologies for having the camera on this view.
All good. So just a quick introduction. We received well over 90 questions, and a lot of the questions are things that are just not in the purview of the Medicaid Inspector General. We received a lot of questions that were about policies with regard to self-direction, financial considerations within self-direction, caps on internal, all very important things, but nothing that the Medicaid Inspector General actually has a voice in. Almost all of these things, in fact, are things that it is OPWDD leadership that has the voice in those. So we hope that we will have in the future a meeting similar to this with OPWDD leadership. But today, we're going to be concentrating on OMIG scope. And here to kick it off is Frank Walsh.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to the coalition. We couldn't be more pleased to be here. Very important subject, very important discussion, and we're here to dispel the myth. Hopefully, at the end of this, you will not view neither myself nor this office as the big bad wolf. I'm here to, kind of remove the curtain a little bit. moving on to the next slide, I'll be just providing sort of an overview, and then I'll turn it over to Michael to talk about our audit process. But the Office of the Medicaid Inspector General, we were established in 2006. We're approaching our 20th year of operation, which is very exciting. And we were established as an independent entity within the New York State Department of Health to promote and protect the integrity of the Medicaid program. Well, what does that mean? Well, the independence and part of the reason why we were created was, that the identification that there needed to be sort of a firewall between the development of the policies and the enforcement of the policies. So, so while we have a very close connection with the programmatic agencies, so with the Department of Health and with the Office of Persons with Developmental Disabilities, we have very close connections with them and other Medicaid-funded agencies. We don't actually establish the policies. We do have advice and input when we see something that is, needs to be reviewed, but we don't create the policies, and which gives us sort of the ability and the distance in order to conduct our oversight. So we're a relatively small agency, about 500 staff, and we operate all across the state in 7 specific regional offices. Our mission is to, as we've said, enhance the integrity of the Medicaid program by preventing and detecting fraudulent and abusive and wasteful practices within the program and recovering improperly expended Medicaid funds while promoting high quality care. So the focus here, and I think, as we discuss it, we're focused both on those intentional actions and unintentional actions. We're ensuring that the program is operating in accordance with the guidelines that are established by the programmatic agencies, and sort of everything is, sort of within our purview. And here's a little bit of where we will remove the curtain. In carrying out this mission, we conduct and coordinate investigations, detection, audit, and review of Medicaid providers to ensure that they're complying with the laws and regulations. I will exercise my right to, make one amendment here, which is reflective of what we're doing here. It's also engagement and education with the provider community, because, we're not operating in a vacuum. We really want to understand what's happening in the environment and what the practical realities of, the programs that we're engaging in. So we put a high focus on this front end, kind of meeting with providers, understanding, what they're concerned about. And we use that in determining where we're going to look in the future. Being a smaller agency, and just to put it in context, we completed just under 3,000 investigations and audits in our last annual report, which was for 2023. And where we see things in the course of our investigations and audits, we not only take action ourselves, but we're required to take all fraudulent activities and refer that to the AG's office. And we also conduct referrals to other programmatic agencies that have regulatory oversight in the area that we're looking at. So if we see something in the course of what we're doing that is, unrelated to the Medicaid program, which is our primary focus, we bring that to the attention of the appropriate state, federal, or law enforcement agency that is responsible for those activities. Next slide. This is just a sense of our guiding principles. Certainly, first and foremost is wanting to make sure that everything's operating within the Medicaid program as it was intended to operate. So maintaining that integrity within the program. As we talked about, and has been a focus of this agency since we were created, and we continue to sort of put a renewed focus on it. Improving awareness and stakeholder relationships. This is based upon the principle, kind of that it's best to start off with a carrot than to come in with the stick. So we need to work with you all and, kind of understand. And, we pride ourselves on allowing for that communication during the course of our activities, so that we're just not, enforcing requirements that are unrelated to, kind of how the programs are operated. We put a high, in that same regard, we put a high focus on compliance and self-disclosure. That's for a very practical reason. We are a small agency, so the best defense, is to make sure that everyone is compliant with the rules to the greatest extent that they can. We have a focus where we go out and we conduct compliance reviews of various providers, and we encourage them that where they see something, they say something to us, and then we can work with them to ensure that essentially it's addressed. And the benefit of that review, that compliance and self-disclosure, is that kind of once you've rectified the problem, there isn't that need to sort of, go through an audit. And from a provider perspective, you protect yourself from future audits as well by taking these activities. Certainly, as with any program in the human services area, we want to make sure that the care is quality and it's appropriate, and that we're maximizing the use of resources. And this has become a renewed focus, all across the governmental landscape, just to sort of make sure that resources are used efficiently. And in that, we have a very strong track record here in New York, achieving over $4 billion in cost savings, cost savings and recoveries, something that we're very proud of, here at the New York State OMIG. Next slide. Where does our authority rest? Well, when we were created as an independent agency, it was created in statute. That's the Public Health Law, Article 1, Title 3, which outlines all of the requirements for this agency, which involve our relationship with the provider community, our audit and investigation authority, how we interact with other program agencies, and how they should interact with us, and then how we should report out, to the public. So it does go into our annual reporting requirements. And one thing that I sort of call to your attention, are those public reports that are available up on our website. We're not trying to sort of hide the ball in any way. We want to make sure that everyone is aware of what we're doing, what we're finding, what we're seeing, and hopefully you find the annual report to be helpful and in outlining that. The other authority that we sort of point to is in the regulations, Part 18, 504.3, which outlines the duties of providers. And sort of as a provider within the Medicaid program, these are three major themes. You're required to sort of keep and maintain contemporaneous records that kind of back up the service that's provided, and that it's provided appropriately, keep all necessary records for 6 years, and be open to audit from the OMIG. And then 18 New York CRR Part 517, which outlines our audit authority and our recovery authority that Mike will talk about a little bit later in this presentation. What are we focused on now? And this comes from another document that we have available. It's up on our website every year, from our work plan, where we try to lay out at the beginning of the year what our objectives are, what are the areas that we're going to be focused on, over the course of the next year. And this is in alignment with the state, programmatic year, in alignment with, what the programmatic agencies, the governor's office, and all parties sort of concerned have outlined as areas of focus. Two that we've already talked about: compliance and self-disclosure. We recently renewed our compliance requirements, and we're in the process of testing those requirements. The newness of them is really to try and gain greater acceptance, greater accountability, greater integration of compliance techniques within the management of providers. We're focused on self-disclosure. It's an area that we're focused on, the federal government is focused on. And there have been several notable federal audits and investigations that sort of go to the failure to self-disclose inappropriate payments. So definitely want to get that message out. It should be no surprise that we're focused in the home and community-based services area. This is the largest single segment of the program in terms of expenditures. So a lot of press, a lot of focus in this area. Equally, we are engaged both on the fee-for-service side and in managed care. Significant expenditures are happening through the managed care program. We're there to make sure that those services are provided appropriately and managed care plans are complying with their responsibilities. We have outlined within their contracts specific requirements that they are accomplishing on our behalf, on the state's behalf. Those include program integrity requirements and reporting requirements. And other area of focus, which comes out of a recent OSC audit and focus on our part, is with regard to our recipient restriction program. And essentially making sure that all parties are complying with that requirement. And then another area of focus is with regard to pharmacy. Given the interaction and the expenditures in that area, it's a primary area of focus. And I think that's the overview of what we do. And I think we can break here if there's any discussion on OMIG. If not, we'll turn it over to Michael to go through the audit process.
I'm sorry, Frank, I just wanted to ask one clarifying question if possible.
Sure, no problem.
Can you talk a little bit, or maybe it's coming up, but can you talk a little bit about the fraud, abuse, and waste and how you define that when you're looking at auditing providers?
So So, I think that, kind of fraud, waste, and abuse is defined within, within statute and regs. But the way that, I've kind of characterized it is, the fraud and the abuse are, really, kind of intentional actions, where the there is an awareness of what the requirements are, and a failure to comply, whether for whatever reason. The waste really goes to, the inefficient application. There may not be, there may be an awareness, there may not be a full awareness of what the requirements are. The program, requires providers to be aware of what, the program standards are, but they may not be applied, appropriately. And then, in those areas, we're looking to, identify the behavior and to correct the behavior, and ensure that operations are going forward, appropriately going forward.
Thank you.
So I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Frank. We can go to the next slide, please. And actually, I think the next slide after that. So what I'm going to talk today a little bit about is an overview of the types of audits we perform, the process we utilize for performing those audits, the typical process. So, there are different types of audits and methods that OMIG utilizes in its audit function. Audits typically distinguish from, say, investigations, which is really looking more closely at the fraud and abuse that Frank was speaking about earlier. Audits are very much focused on looking at provider compliance with program and billing requirements, and assessing if there are any overpayments that were made as a result of non-compliance. The two types or methods by which we audit, we use these terms are, in some respects, somewhat misnomers, but they're what we have in the regulations is field audits versus desk audits. So field audits typically begin, and I'll be getting into the detail of this process in a little bit, begins with an audit notification, an entrance conference, an exit conference. These are really reviews where we need to review provider documentation in support of the billings and payments that they received, before we're in a position to make any determination with respect to findings. A desk audit, on the other hand, is where we're in a position to review data that we have access to, claims data, other data sources, and on the face of that, make a determination of whether or not an overpayment occurred. A good example of this is where there would be billing for services for a recipient or Medicaid enrollee who is deceased. So billing for services after the date of death would trigger a potential desk audit, looking for, and the provider would have opportunities in all of our processes to submit documentation and arguments counter to the findings outlined in any draft report. I put on here also recovery audit, contractor, and third-party liability. These are two other types of audits that occur. Typically, they take the form of desk audits. I mention them because they are handled through a different unit within OMIG. So if there's any questions or issues with that, that's I won't be speaking to those types of audits that we perform. Next slide. So background information, this is going a little bit deeper into what Frank was talking about. Our audits are performed pursuant to Part 517 of Title 18. and involves fiscal audits and reviews of a provider's claims, books, records, reports, or other available documentation. The purpose of these reviews is to determine compliance and with program requirements and determine the amount of overpayments. Oftentimes, people will use the term overpayment and penalty or fine interchangeably. That's not correct. An overpayment is recovery of monies that should not have been paid. OMIG has separate fining authority, monetary penalty authority. We have the authority to sanction behavior, and as Frank said, we also have the authority to do referrals to law enforcement, but those are really limited to instances where we have fraud or abuse. So some intentional act to defraud the Medicaid program or practices that are inconsistent with the sound business. In those instances, we could take other actions, but typically in our audits, what we're looking for is really looking at overpayments. Doesn't mean that an audit couldn't discover fraud or abuse and lead to one of these other actions, but that is not the reason why we commence an audit. Next slide.
Mike,
So,
could I just make a point of just an additional point on that? What's often misunderstood also about our agency is that we are not a prosecutorial agency, and I'm sorry if you mentioned that, Mike. When Mike refers to referring to law enforcement, that is, criminal fraud it's in their bailiwick. That is not, we are required to refer those to the Office of Medicaid Inspector General's Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. I just wanted to make that point if it hadn't been made already. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So what I wanted to move on to next was just briefly talking about our audit protocols. So where we are commencing audits of providers in our fee-for-service program, what we do is we develop and post on our website protocols that outline the findings that we would typically be looking for. So this is a process we go through, and you can see in the infographic there, we work internally to learn about the program. What are the programmatic requirements? What are the regulations? What are the laws governing? What policies or directives have been issued by the oversight agency? We then also work directly with that agency. They have an opportunity to review the protocol, provide input, make sure that we are interpreting and understanding their guidance and directives correctly. We do some internal quality review that encompasses legal checks and checking things for consistency. We also do stakeholder reach outs. Frank said, important for us to do provider engagement. So we do engage with provider associations on protocols that we have developed. And then we will post those protocols and make them available on our website. The thing to keep in mind with respect to audit protocols is that they are, and this is true for our audits as well, which I should probably say from the beginning, we do audits looking back in time. So a protocol on our website is going to identify service dates, and typically those service dates are going to be 2-3 years, the end date of the protocol, which might cover a 6-year or longer period, is going to look at, going to cover that period. Our audits, our protocols are looking at periods in the past. We do not audit in real time. We typically wait for claims to be final, not subject to future or further adjudication or adjustments. So, the protocols that you will see on our website, and I don't think we have a protocol that governs this program because it's not an area that we have actively audited in the past, but the protocols speak to a set period of time. It might cover.
Mike, sorry to interrupt. It's Jackie. I'm just saying, when you're saying we haven't audited this program, you talking about self-direction specifically, or?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, that's.
Yeah. So So the protocols and our audits are looking back in time, not in real time. Next slide. Generally, in conducting audits, the flow would look at 3 phases. We'll get into each one next, but we have a planning phase, a fieldwork and analysis phase, and reporting phase. Next slide. And slide of that.
Michael, we're gonna pause here just for a little bit of discussion if we can. So Gabby, if you could, thank you. Yeah, so just want to drive home that point in case it's not clear to people that there are at this point no audit protocols around community classes because there hasn't been any audit of community classes. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Jim, just
And-
as a discussion, so just to clarify, because there have been audits of community rehabilitation and respite and brokerage, and there are protocols for those self-directed services. So when we talk self-direction, there's the list of HCBS waiver services that are under, and the waiver services would be IDGS. But from what I'm hearing Michael say is they look backwards. So if when they develop a protocol, they would work with the OPWDD on a protocol for IDGS because that does fall under the fee for service, and it's Medicaid funded. Is that correct, Michael?
Correct. Any Medicaid service, is subject to our oversight. And as Michael said, we're looking sort of backwards in time, which allows us to develop and to identify and to further develop what are the requirements of the programmatic agencies. And as I was going to sort of jump in with regard to the protocol, we would and have engage with the provider community, as well, to make sure that they too are kind of understand what the requirements are, and as we are reflecting it, and as the programmatic agency is reflecting it, the protocols that we've developed are appropriate. And I think that's an important point, because we're not only focusing on what the programmatic agency is saying, but kind of what is the practical reality on the ground. We don't want there to be kind of, when we engage in an audit, we don't want this to be sort of a surprise or a gotcha. We want everyone to sort of be aware of, hey, these are the ground rules from which, this engagement is operating, and, so that there can be fair communication through the process. So I think that's really an important opportunity to, kind of get aware and to, if we don't have it right, to let us know that we don't have it right. And I will say we receive comments regularly from stakeholders as we review our protocols, and we incorporate their concerns in those before they're issued.
If I
So
may,
the feedback would be to engage, what I'm hearing, and it's very positive, since there is not a protocol that OMIG has in place on your website yet for IDGS as a waiver service, to provide that feedback through the larger provider community and the stakeholders that are here before or as that's being developed. But
Absolutely.
is it safe to say that you follow, as you mentioned before, the policies of the the governing. So in our case, OPWDD establishes, as you mentioned, policies and directives. So you do take that, if we as providers are right now following the policies and directives of OPWDD for the service as it's laid out in the waiver, that's going to be your starting point to develop the protocol?
That's correct. And I was going to mention, as Jim had mentioned earlier, that we anticipate that there will be a fuller conversation with OPWDD, in the development and refinement of these policies. We're going to be looking to them, in the development of any audits down the road, in this area.
But can I just make one point on the protocols, and I think it'll be good news, welcome news to everyone on the call. Shortly, I would say within the next week, on our website, we list all the protocols, but we've done a rather comprehensive overview of that site, of that specific site on protocols. There'll be much more information about what protocols are, what they're not, more information in terms of the current protocols, and a link to an archive of all previous protocols, and with a dynamic FAQ on the most common questions we get on protocols. But in each and every case, because I have a role in it, we absolutely reach out to the stakeholder community when the protocols are in the draft form to seek comment and input for consideration. In a number of cases, those protocols are adjusted accordingly. And there's many occasions where we will have conversations, whether it's a session like this or an individual phone call, to inform those final protocols. So it truly is, Frank's point earlier about operating in a vacuum. We want to avoid that. So absolutely, going forward, if there comes a time for protocols specific to this arena, this stakeholder community will absolutely be involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We'd be thrilled to host one or even several meetings like this to help with that process, because there's a lot of gray areas. And not to put you on the spot, Michael, but you shared with me that in your office there's a sign which says something like, "If it's not written down, it didn't happen." And I'm probably misquoting here.
Well, I mean, the fundamental principles in conducting an audit, right, is what we're looking for. And as Frank talked about in the overview, is providers have an obligation to maintain contemporaneous documentation justifying their right to receive payment. So certainly I have a sign in my office of, "Did you document it?" Because if it's not documented anywhere, then there's nothing for my auditors to look at in the audit. So, certainly at the core of what we're doing in conducting the audit is, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, is asking for and receiving the documentation from the provider, demonstrating that they complied with the requirements of the program as set out in law, regulation, and the directives of whichever agency, this case OPWDD, has established.
Yeah, and so the provider has to write it down, and they're writing down their compliance with the written directives, not any kind of whispered directive.
I mean, I mean, when we say whisper directives, I mean, if there is a directive issued, and I would expect it to be written, but this isn't a program where we have developed protocols, so I don't want to speculate on what's out there or not out there in terms of the directives.
Nope,
Just to add to that, Jim, so as you're talking about directives, and I wrote that down as well, because could that be including trainings that the state issued and are recorded, and there's a PowerPoint on, and included in the trainings more nuanced information on how to get at approving a certain item that makes sure that it meets the requirements. I think that's where we're at. And I have experienced an OMIG audit, and it's not, to me, as black and white as the protocol. I understand it's not, you come and you check the boxes, but there's often times you're requesting additional documentation or clarification. So I just wanted to know if you could point that out, that it's not just as simple as this says this here, we see this here, you're good to go. But usually an auditor will request additional information if there is some concern or questions. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate that point. I think that, and how I would sort of characterize it is, we're the protocol is laying out what the guidelines of the program are. They're laying out what we collectively believe the standard is. But since, kind of life gets messy, and, kind of how rules are interpreted, how rules are applied, part of the audit process is to gather that additional information that sort of goes to, okay, you have what the written directive is, but why we think you may have deviated from that. Why did you make the professional judgment that you made? And therein lies where I would think we'll be seeking that additional clarity and information to sort of outline, that, we're not just, passing over, some instruction that you received. I mean, we deal in the black and white and the written, but we also understand that there are, kind of whispers and community norms and things like that aren't necessarily, wrong. They're not the judgment. You're making a judgment. We're trying to sort of operate. And, we want to make sure that we get the fullest possible picture, and we're being as fair as we can possibly be.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, folks.
In our audit,
Go ahead.
we consider everything. We have, as I'll talk about later in the presentation, we have, there is frequent and consistent communication between the audit team and the provider that we are auditing. Certainly when arguments are raised, well, OPWDD or whichever agency told me to do this, then there will be and should be follow-up then to that, say, then, do you have that in writing? If the provider said no, we may reach out to OPWDD and say, this is what we are hearing. Is this consistent with the direction that you gave? As Frank said, we don't operate in a vacuum. We listen to what the providers are telling us in the audit process. A best practice is share everything with the audit team. Don't presume that we know everything. Because sometimes providers have had communication directly with an oversight agency that may be unique to them. And yes, my team will accept everything. And if they have questions, they will follow up and obtain whatever additional information they feel they need to make to reach the correct conclusion with respect to the claim that we're reviewing, or claims that we're reviewing.
And Jim, if I may, these are questions. I'm not gaveling down questions at all, but there's more in depth, as Mike mentioned. There's a lot of information upcoming in this presentation that really goes through, and these questions are fantastic. I think if Mike can continue now, it'll provide even more insight and inform additional questions. So just a thought. Thank you.
All right, so if we can go to the next slide. So in the planning phase of an audit, within our agency, we've talked about protocols within the division of Medicaid audit. We have staff who have developed expertise in specific programs, whether that's OPWDD, OMH, OASIS, DOH programs, and they work closely with the oversight agency, and they work closely with every audit team who may be looking at a particular project. So audit projects are developed by them. They facilitate data extractions and identifying providers who may be appropriate for audit. There are a number of different factors we look at in considering who to audit. Have they been audited in the past? Are there aspects of the provider currently under audit, other business lines? Certainly not looking to burden providers with multiple simultaneous audits. And then we select and schedule audits in accordance with the priorities outlined in our work plan and the availability of our regional office staff, because OMIG we have offices throughout the state, and auditors located in every office throughout the state, all of whom conduct audits, not generally, but oftentimes within the region that they cover. Next slide. The audit criteria, again, the audit protocols summarize the specific criteria, but certainly we rely on, and speaking generally, not specific necessarily to this program, Department of Health criteria such as Title 10 of the NYCRR, social services, mental hygiene. We also rely on the billing manuals and guidelines and policies outlined there, and any administrative directive memoranda that may have been issued, or ADMs. Next slide. So once we've selected a provider for audit, the audit opens with, and this again is specific to sort of the full audit process, what I talked about at the beginning of field audits. This would commence with an audit notification letter, which notifies the provider of our intent to audit the provider for the specified service type and audit period. The audit period in these audits are typically a 3-year period. Again, looking back in time, it informs the provider of the types of documents that will be requested during the audit, and requests that certain documentation be made available to us when we schedule and hold the entrance conference. After the letter is sent, the audit supervisor assigned to that audit will reach out to establish a date, schedule a date for the entrance conference to be held. Next slide. What the audit notification does, it is a regulatory requirement that we issue these in our field audit. It defines the period and the type of review that we'll be conducting. It informs the provider to hold the records until the audit is completed. The entrance conference by regulation needs to be held within 60 days of the audit notification letter. We can extend for an additional 60 days upon written notification. Next slide. So once we move from the audit notification, we then hold an entrance conference. So the purpose, as you can see on the image, this is structured. We have purpose, we have scope. Purpose typically would be saying evaluate billing practices, documentation for compliance laws and regs, all the things I talked about earlier in the presentation when we conduct our audits. The scope, what is the program area you're looking? What are the specific categories of services, the rates or the procedure codes? And if we are conducting this audit utilizing sampling and extrapolation, it would define the number of claims and paid amounts within our universe that we'd be looking at. Next slide. Audit procedures would be the next section in the entrance conference, the list of recipients in our sample, complete record of the audit period, electronic versus paper records, always important to know how you maintain your records. Are you maintaining them in paper form? Are they maintained electronically? If they're maintained in hard copy, are they available on site, off site? Always best practice when you get that audit notification letter and when the entrance conference is being held, to be able to know when and how to obtain the records that we're going to be requesting or are requesting. And then it also addresses logistical issues. Who are the staff at the provider that we should be reaching out to and engaging on regularly with any follow-up requests or additional requests for records? And also not voiding any additional claims that are within the scope of the audit period, as that can interfere with the audit process. Next slide. Documentation requested in the engagement letter. So this is, what we said at the beginning in the audit notification, we would ask for certain information to be made available. So we would look to obtain that so we can get the audit started. Certainly, there's a need to, if at the entrance conference is an appropriate time also to raise any additional audits you may be undergoing from other agencies, federal or state. OMIG is not the only agency with audit authority. It is the only agency with audit authority of the Medicaid program. But certainly if you're participating in other programs, you may have other audits ongoing. If there's been any self-disclosures in progress or completed, also good to know that. I'd also add like bankruptcy as another. If there's been any bankruptcy filings or things like that, that's good for us to know as well. And finally, of course, part of the entrance conference is to answer any questions the provider may have with respect to the process or what to expect. As I said, and we can go to the next slide, our purpose in this process is to, certainly we're here to conduct the audit, but we want to make sure that it's an engaged process. And if there's questions or anything that we need to know that's being communicated to us, I encourage communication, frequent and often on both ends. Some of this we've gone over before, so I won't repeat myself. Once we've had the entrance conference, it holds up open the regulatory period to maintain documents. So typically in our regulations, I think Frank may have mentioned this earlier, in the overview, providers are required to maintain documentation for a period of 6 years. Once you get that audit notification and the entrance conference is held, you are required to maintain that documentation until the audit is concluded. So yes, you have a 6-year period to retain, but it is extended if there is an audit and the audit is in process. So critical point, don't destroy records if there's an audit in progress. I think we can go to the next slide. So auditors will certainly know dates of service under review. If we're doing a random sample that's generated prior to the start of the audit, we will share a list identifying which recipient or beneficiary files we need to be made available to us to conduct the audit. We will review the document set with the provider and the audit team. This allows us to understand how the records are maintained and reduce the number of interactions we may need to have about which documents are needed, which helps keep the audit process moving along. Next slide. We will request original and complete records. We will review the randomly selected sample of claims and supporting documentation as appropriate and necessary. Any missing documentation or other questions or issues will be communicated to the provider and an opportunity given to supplement any documentation, the additional documentation the provider is able to locate. Next slide. So, sort of what are the typical things we're looking for? Were the correct dates billed? Were the appropriate rate or procedure codes used? Were records, did the records contain all of the documentation that is required? And were services performed in accordance with regulations and the provider manuals or as applicable? Next slide. At the conclusion of the field work, we've reviewed the documentation. We have reviewed all the samples that we are auditing. We, on the fee-for-service side, will hold what we call a pre-exit conference. So prior to the end of the field work, the auditors will inform the provider of anything else that we're missing, anything else that we need, give the provider an opportunity to submit any additional documentation before we reach the end of the field audit phase. Once that's concluded, we would then proceed to an exit conference. Next slide. So the reporting phase, so we've done planning, we've done our field work, we now move into what we refer to as the reporting phase. This is where the provider is provided the first official notification of our initial findings, our draft proposed findings. Next slide. The first step is to hold an exit conference. So we hold an entrance conference at the beginning of field work. We hold an exit conference at the end of the process. You will receive an exit conference summary prior to meeting with the audit team. You'll also receive data, claim detail information for the claims that are in our sample. Purpose of the exit conference is to review our initial audit findings. Not the end of documentation. Providers can continue to provide additional documentation and information. Certainly, we want that earlier in the audit process if possible, but if once presented with the findings, you're able to locate additional documentation or records, we will accept that throughout the course of the audit engagement. And then we will explain the next step, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but we would then proceed to a draft audit report, final audit report, and also discuss hearing rights and answer any questions the provider may have at that juncture. Next slide. This is just a screenshot of a typical exit conference summary. Next slide. Included with the exit conference C, this would go through listing out the sample number, patient information, and which errors, if any, are associated with those samples. Right. Some of this has already been covered, so we can go to the next slide. The draft audit report is required by regulation. After the exit conference, giving the provider an opportunity to submit additional documentation or information to the audit team, we will, and we've had an opportunity to review all of that, we will then produce a draft audit report to the provider, which will identify our proposed findings, our initial draft findings. Next slide. Provider has 30 days to submit written objections to the findings contained within the draft audit report. Regulations do require, so this is a phase I really highlight for you. If there are arguments, if there's information up to that point that had not been shared, but really any arguments or issues, really very critical to put that in your response to the draft audit report, because the provider by regulation is limited to those issues and those arguments in their written objections to the draft audit report when you get to the hearing phase, should you request an administrative hearing, I would say. So if you don't argue it in response to the draft, you won't be able to raise it anew at the administrative hearing. And we are required, and we do review the response prior to issuing a final audit report, which may lead to some additional adjustments. Other thing I will say here, in this phase, there's 30 days to submit written objections. Certainly, if there is a need, and it goes back to the importance of communication back to the audit team, if there's need for additional time to respond, certainly reach out to the audit team as long as there's a justification for why the additional time is needed. We're always happy to work with providers to make sure that you have sufficient time to submit your responses. Next slide, please. This takes us to the final audit report. Next slide. The final audit report contains some additional elements. It looks similar to the draft audit report, except that now it is the final. The final audit report will indicate whether or not we received a response from the provider, and you will see within the final audit report whether there were any adjustments made as a result of the reviewing the provider's response. Typically, this would be a downward adjustment through the removal of specific findings, which may result then in a reduced overpayment that we are seeking to recover. It may also result in no overpayment if it reduces it down to $0. At this phase, we are required to issue a final audit report, even if the amount we're seeking to recover ends up being $0. So just something to keep in mind there, that you can respond to the draft and it can, based on our review, it could eliminate the overpayment altogether. But in addition to identifying the amount of the overpayment we're seeking to recover, it would also outline then the options available to the provider for making repayment, and also outlining your right to request an administrative hearing to further challenge the determinations. Next slide. So repayment options, you can make full payment by check or money order within 20 days. Enter into a repayment agreement. Typically, this would be to make basically alternative arrangements for repayment, taking into account additional time that the provider may need to make that payment. Interest applied if repayment terms, or interest will be applied if the terms of repayment exceed 90 days from the date of the final audit report. And failure to select the payment option, we'll use any remedy available to us to recoup the dollars overpaid. We do also have a financial hardship process where providers who the amount of the overpayment or recovery would pose a hardship provides an opportunity to apply for relief. We do review financial documentation to tailor a repayment schedule to the provider's specific fiscal condition. That needs to be renewed annually. So could be adjusted upward or downward in the future as the provider's financial condition improves or worsens. Hearing rights by regulation and law. Hearing right requests need to be made within 60 days from the date of the final audit report. The agency by regulation cannot extend this period. So critical to submit those requests timely. And Part 519 of Title 18 lists out the full hearing rights available to providers. One thing I didn't mention in the PowerPoint presentation that I did want to say is that at any point in the audit process, up to when we issue the draft, if we determine that there is substantial compliance, we haven't identified overpayments, the provider doesn't have significant compliance issues warranting us moving forward with the audit, we do have the ability to issue what we call a summation, which closes out the audit without recoupment. So I didn't mention that earlier. I did want to mention that. But certainly once we get to the draft, we would go to we would issue a final in any case. Next slide.
Yeah, Michael, if we can pause here again. I know you want to go over best practices. You've got, well, I know I've heard from a couple people that they need to leave right at 1:30, and so I want to make sure that we get some visibility on a couple of questions. One thing, the chat really lit up around the idea of documenting the decision, and around you've shared with me the idea that if there's doubt, go to your oversight agency. And what we're hearing from fiscal intermediaries live here in the chat is they go to their oversight agency and they're told, it's written down, it's up to you now how to apply it. So what's a fiscal intermediary to do? They see something that's in a gray area, they go ask for interpretation, and they're told it's up to you. Are they safe then? And okay, they told us to apply our judgment. We applied our judgment. We think this is a great program we've been talking about audit and such. This is a great program for an individual with developmental disabilities to live a meaningful life. That's what we think. We're going to pay for it. Are they safe at that point? Or
I couldn't speculate. I mean, it's not. I don't do well with hypotheticals. I think that if they go to the oversight agency and the agency responds to them, they should document that, and we would take that into consideration in the audit. But that's not the only thing that we would be looking at in the audit. We would need to be looking at. We look at the entire claim and everything with respect to whether or not the payment of that claim was appropriate or not. So I can't speculate that if they said it's up to you, then it's up to them. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some other issue with the claim that might lead to a disallowance being taken. I'm not necessarily comfortable getting into.
Yep, no, I understand. Yeah, Linda, you want to jump in?
Yeah. Can I just ask the clarification on the audits? So, and I think you had it in a prior slide, but there was some questions in the chat. So I know for us personally, if you could describe this a little bit more, like OPWDD, our oversight agency, does fiscal audits, and we've had the result of that fiscal audit then go to OMIG for the repayment part phase of it. So there was discussion that even though you don't OMIG directly, when your office does a direct audit, that's one thing. But there are other audits, and there's also self-disclosures that you mentioned. I just wanted to make sure that the broader community is aware, even if you have not audited yourself the IDGS waiver service category yet, because you don't have the protocol yet, there have been audits done of the IDGS by OPWDD, which ultimately could go to your office if it results in, for that end phase. Could you talk about that a little bit?
I would have to look more into that, but certainly at a high level, OMIG is the entity, as Frank outlined at the beginning, vested with the authority to audit the Medicaid program and recover Medicaid overpayments. There are certainly programs that we work jointly with OPWDD to meet our auditing needs. That's allowed for under the regulations. They do, I know, conduct audits of their OPWDD providers, but those audit reports and the recovery of the overpayments do need to flow through OMIG, and I know that our audit team here, there are staff that coordinate with OPWDD in the conducting of those audits and the issuance of our audit reports associated with their reviews.
And then just one other clarifying point. Could you briefly said the word extrapolation. This is the word that keeps me up at night. Could you describe that experience? Because I think it's important for folks to understand when there is a claim that is disallowed and it's subject to payback, that it's not just as straightforward as that.
Well, I mean, I think so. We, depending on the audits that we're conducting, we may choose to conduct the audit by pulling a random sample of the claims under review. We do this because it would be a significant administrative burden on the provider, certainly, to have to pull thousands, give us all documentation, right? So, you know, the random sample, typically in most audits, around, it's usually 100 claims. If we were in some methodologies, it could be as high as 250 claims. You know, I don't think we have the time to get into the weeds on the topic, but basically it's a method whereby we look at a smaller subset of the claims. It's a random sample. It is intended to be and designed to be representative of the universe of claims. If errors are found on individual samples, taking that information would then be projected to the universe of claims. We have a statistician that assists with this process to arrive at an overpayment amount reflective of those errors when projected to the universe.
Thank you.
The other thing that I would just say about the extrapolation is where we're using extrapolation, we're disclosing that, and in the final audit report or earlier in the process, all the materials that were related to that extrapolation are shared in the conversation. So again, no surprises, so that everyone can kind of react and be operating on the same kind of stage.
And if I could just add one thing, and Mike, again, I'm sorry if you had touched on this. I had to step away for about 30 seconds. I think it's important also to understand, it's a comment was made earlier about, I think, Jim, you said it, about a class that certainly is considered valuable. It is a great community class. It's important to understand that it is not, we are not the arbiter of whether something is valuable or good. I mean, we can all agree that there's many options for people, and we can all agree that the more access, the better. Ours is to make sure that, whether it's classes or any other part of the Medicaid sector, that the services being provided are actually meeting statutory and regulatory standards. And I know that sounds bureaucratic, but hopefully that can also allay some fears that that the more we have these conversations, and today is very valuable, and understanding better the audit process, is that you're more informed about what we do and the limitations of our authority and our decision making. So I just wanted to make that point. Thanks.
Yep, and I wasn't trying to put you in the position of being the arbiter of what's good or not. I'm
of course.
I'm just trying to point out that the end result of what we're all doing is really to assist people with developmental disabilities in exercising choice and leading meaningful lives, and just don't want us to lose sight of that. I've been able, Bill, to have a couple of conversations with you in the last few weeks and understand that you're aligned with that. I understand that your role is to ensure compliance with the rules. And I've also heard repeatedly that when people are in doubt, go to your oversight agency. And the difficulty that I'm seeing is that the fiscal intermediaries are going to the oversight agency and getting the response, it's up to you. So it feels like it's an issue. We're not going to solve it today.
Well, I think, and I my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but everything you're doing to work with the oversight agency to provide some clarity in this arena is absolutely vital. And if there's questions, and this is part of this exercise here today, is after those conversations, if any FI, whether it's an immediate situation or any provider in the sector has questions that hopefully we can address, want to allay any fear that if you contact OMIG, that you're going to end up on some target list and that now you're going to be investigated, you're going to get an audit. It's in everyone's best interest to reach out, ask the questions, provide some clarity. It's a lot easier to avoid a problem before it happens than have to resolve it later. If there's one key takeaway, I'm sure my colleagues would agree, is the more we hear and can provide some clarity about what we can provide clarity on, we want to do it. And by the same token, it's very informative for us as we move forward to hear what the questions and the concerns are. Because if you get 50 questions on the same topic, there's a vacuum there. And whether it's us or an oversight agency or collectively, there's something that needs to be done to fill that vacuum. Because vacuums aren't usually filled with good things unless they're filled with the facts. So thank you.
Bill, thank you for that, because I think that's basically how the chat's running. I think we're all realizing, and the importance of this is for the stakeholders, meaning the fiscal intermediaries and the Medicaid beneficiaries who many of us represent, understand that when we're told from the oversight agency, OMIG is going to audit this, that's not exactly what's happening. We have a little bit more clarity now about how that works. And you've also just said that when we're all asking a question about the same thing, well, then we need a little bit more investigation into why that question keeps happening. So I think this has been, we can't get all the answers today. And I know people are frustrated with that, but this is a really terrific step to where we're heading. This conversation is what needs to keep happening. So Jim, where are we at now? Do you have best practices, Michael, you have to go through still? Because I don't know, are we finishing at 1:30?
We're finishing at 1:30, and I know we're going to lose a lot of people then. We do have this PowerPoint available to people after the fact as a PDF, and we are going to have follow-up meetings. So Michael, why don't we turn it over to you to get through however many best practices you can get through in 5 minutes, and then we'll maybe do a final sum up. Make sense?
Sounds good. Slide. All right, so this we can go through relatively quickly. This summarizes what I have said throughout the presentation. When you're informed of the audit, assemble, inform your team, get the key staff member together, make sure they're available and accessible to the audit team. Understand your process for storing and retrieving medical billing records. Some things to consider there that I've mentioned previously. Advise the audit team of any bankruptcies or self-disclosures, and communicate with the auditors throughout the process. If there's issues, if people are going to be on vacation, if you're having difficulty pulling records, better to inform us of those issues earlier in the process rather than later. Post-audit, providers required to have compliance programs or otherwise have compliance programs should consider any adjustments that need to be made as a result of our audits. Also need to assess any self-disclosure obligations. Our audits are for a set period of time. I've said in the past, they look back in time, typically a 3-year period. Providers may have issues that were identified in the course of the audit that are ongoing or occurred prior to the audit period that may be subject to self-disclosure. Providers have an obligation to report, return, and explain any overpayments through our self-disclosure process. As Bill said, it's better to identify and report those issues earlier in the process than waiting for an audit to occur. And there's a link on the slide to where additional information on OMIG self-disclosure program can be found. Next slide. We've talked a lot about documentation. Something we want to also, I always highlight, is lost, destroyed, or damaged records. Typically, years past, this was typically lost due to fire, flood, tornado, but could also be the result of, in the more modern age, loss due to corrupted data files, lost access to files, could be the result of theft. We have a process for providers to self-disclose lost or destroyed records. To self-report that issue to OMIG, those can be submitted to OMIG no later than 30 days after discovery. Information on that process, I think, can be found on the link in the prior slide on our self-disclosure process. But the key point here is that it's better for us to know before we commence the audit that you have had records lost, destroyed, stolen, gone, rather than us showing up for audit and learning that 3 years ago the records were destroyed in a flood. So, again, encourage early notification of those issues to our agency so we can consider that as we are planning our audit activities. Next slide. These, I believe, are links to our annual report, and probably, Bill, we could probably send around a link to our 2025 work plan.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. If you're interested in what we did in 2024, you can have a look at that. But I don't know. I have no idea how that one got there. So yes, we have a 2025 work plan. It's on our website, but we'll make sure and edit this accordingly, and our apologies for that.
Yeah. And then finally, I think the next slide contains contact information. There's fraud allegations, where those can go, compliance or self-disclosure questions, etc. I don't know.
Let me make a plug on this, if you don't mind, Mike. The very last area, sorry, Mike, I know we're pressed for time, but that very last dedicated email address, I know some believe that if you email a dedicated email address like that it's not monitored, not responded to. I can guarantee that's not the case here, in part because I monitor it and my colleague. That is a great source, because whether it's compliance, self-disclosure, audit, whatever the question may be, I'll triage it. And in some cases, we make sure that if it's another agency, we do our best to not just give you a general email box. We try to give you a person, a phone number, an email address, an actual human being, so as to cut through the bureaucracy. So really, really encourage you. The last plug here is right here where we on the listserv. If you're not a member of our listserv, a subscriber to our listserv, please do so. It's a really good source of information. Click on that link and you'll be able to subscribe. It takes about 5 seconds, and we really love to have you on board. Thank you.
So that was great, Mike. I challenged you to get through the best practices in 5 minutes. You did it in 6. So, Gabby, if we can pull down the slide, and I'll leave it to the assembled the people who are spotlit now to just kind of do a round robin final word here, and want to thank you so
Frank, we'll
much.
defer to you. If you guys want to wrap up.
Sure. So, I just want to thank the coalition for the opportunity. I just also want to sort of highlight, hopefully we were successful at pulling back the curtain to say that, we're not just simply here to, kind of, enforce the rules, without context. I also want to highlight to, the participants in this call that I have been monitoring the chat, and I see a lot of the comments, and that is what's so valuable about these opportunities. What I've known in my career in government, it's identifying what the issues are and then trying to find constructive solutions. So I thank you all for your comments, and I have some homework to do going forward. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Well, we want to thank you all for the opportunity. Listen, the coalition was born out of what exactly you just said. There's a lot of question in our community about self-direction and some of the issues that we're having. Is it OPWDD? Whose area is it? So I think you've pointed out a lot of things for us today. Opening the door to communication is the most important thing, and having opportunities like this. I know for myself, in the 20 years that my son has been in the system, I've never had the opportunity that I've had like this. So this has been really very eye-opening, and we're really looking forward to next steps. We are going to send out the slides and follow up in our email. After this, you'll all get that, because I see a lot of people are asking us for the emails and things. So don't worry about catching up on the chat. You're going to be able to get all of these addresses. We can't thank you all enough for making yourselves so available to us. We all just want to help our kids, and we think you know that. So nobody's looking to do anything wrong here. It's just kind of been really hard trying to do things right. So hopefully we're going to make things a little bit easier. So at that,
I want to
think
do
we'll
a
wrap it
shout
up.
out. I want to thank you all, but I also want to do a shout out to Gabby. Gabby, thank you so much. She's been invaluable in pulling this together, with us and Jim and the team. But Gabby, all the work you did behind the scenes, I just want to make sure it was recognized. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
We're very, very lucky to have Gabby and Rossetti Government Relations on the side of Family for Disability Rights and C4SD. I think it's what makes us different and makes things like this happen. So thank you for that, Bill. That's very appreciated.
And with that, we bring this to a close. Again, thank you all in the community. This is, we hope, the first of several, and look forward to follow up and additional meetings in the future. Thank you so much.